to have Ramzy, who's here in South Africa as a guest of AMEG, sorry, I've got flu, to launch his new book, The Last Earth, which we do have copies of for sale in the foyer, and Ramzy will be signing them afterwards. So, is it switched on? Oh. Hello? So, this meeting was called, out of all the other events he's attending to, by the Palestine Solidarity organizations, collectively, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, the MRN, Palestine Solidarity Alliance, and South African Jews for a Free Palestine. So the format we're going to follow is to ask Naeem from AMEG just to give a very brief introduction to Ramzy. Ramzy will speak for about half an hour, 40 minutes, and then we'll have a few minutes each from the representatives of the solidarity organizations before opening it up to questions. So we should be finished within an hour and a half maximum. My name's Roshan Dadu, from Palestine Solidarity Campaign, so I'm chairing this event. So maybe Naeem, if you don't mind, just to give a few words as Amek's the host of Ramzy's tour here.
Thanks, Roshan. Well, I suppose I have to speak because this is Ramzy's first public engagement since he arrived in South Africa. So very briefly, just to introduce him, I'm not sure that that's very necessary since you are all here to listen to him. But Dr. Ramzy Baroud is a Palestinian journalist living in the US, but Palestinian journalist, media consultant, author, historian, internationally syndicated columnist. He also is the editor of Palestine Chronicle. I'm sure many of you have read his articles in Palestine Chronicle, which he founded in 1999. Was managing editor of Middle East Eye, former editor-in-chief of Brunei Times, former deputy managing editor of Al Jazeera Online. He's also an academic and taught mass communications, among other things, in various different universities in different parts of the world. He's authored quite a few books, and the latest one is what he's here to launch in South Africa. And so there'll be a book launch on Wednesday at Wits University. If you want more details of the rest of his program in Gauteng and elsewhere, you can talk to Matlatsi, who is, I think, standing outside with the books. She has all the details. So he's here to launch that book, but many of you know him from others of his books that you've seen or read, like My Father Was a Freedom Fighter and others. At the moment, he is non-resident scholar at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, based at Istanbul Zaim University.
Thanks very much, Naeem. Sorry, I've just been reminded that we'll take the messages from each of the solidarity groups first before Ramzy speaks. So I don't know if we want to start with Alan from South African Jews for Free Palestine.
Good evening, comrades. Sorry. Special welcome to Ramzy.
Oh, sorry, yes, they asked if people can speak from there because it's also being recorded.
I'll start off with a cliche. Tell no lies and claim no easy victories. And I think speaking as a South African, as an activist, we know our own society is in a very, very deep crisis as we meet. And that the future that we'd hoped for is melting away. And with that, any chance for meaningful international solidarity. So we find as a solidarity movement, we are divided. We have no clear common objectives. We can't even get a meeting with our Minister of International Relations. We've tried for 2 years and failed. So truly we are at a dark hour, and I'll come with another cliche. It's claimed that before dawn, it's the darkest hour. So we can only hope that in some maybe fantastical way we can turn this around, both as a solidarity movement and as South African society, in the absence of leadership and in the absence of a grassroots movement. But having said that, Ramzy, there's never a cause for despair because we can't afford that luxury. We have the Israeli election tomorrow, which might bring more monsters to power, as unimaginable as it is. So as a Jewish South African, we can only say we have to somehow keep our strength and go forward together. Aman la Sumud.
So now we have Firoza from the Palestine Solidarity Alliance.
Thank you very much, Roshni. Just make it. So, as Roshan said, Palestine Solidarity Alliance, I'm here representing them and really honored to welcome you, Dr. Ramzy. I think many of us in this room have read most of the books and are really looking forward to reading this book. And I know that the book is about dispossession, about exile, about personal stories, and I think why we're all looking forward to it, because it's personal to us. It means a lot to us in South Africa because we've gone through exile, we've gone through dispossession, and right now we have a problem with regards to land, and all of that means to us more now, means more to us now than it ever did before. We are going through xenophobia, we are going through femicide, so there's so much happening in our country and worldwide. We see what's happening in Kashmir right now. So I think there's so many issues, so much happening in terms of fascism throughout the world. And this book is, I think, at the right moment where hopefully it will bring some hope. It will also give us some idea of the level of resistance in Palestine. And just coming back from Palestine myself, and I was just speaking to Mr. Mayat there, that what I picked up from Palestine was not about hopelessness. It was about hope. It was about love. Families were together. Families eat together. There's a culture. The culture of resistance is also about love and not about despair. So I think from taking that up from Alan, there's something we're missing in our country where there is despair, there is a lack of hope. But what we can pick up from the stories in Palestine is let's lift the flags up again, let's lift the baton, and let's begin to continue the fight. So with that, Aluta continua.
So we next have Zakia Mayat who will give a few words on behalf of MRN, Media Review Network.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Good evening to one and all, and it is truly an honor and a pleasure to address you, but more so to welcome our guest, Dr. Baroud. So I'm going to take a slightly different tact. I'm going to share a slightly personal story. So I grew up watching all these activists that I see present in front of me today. All these people that have dedicated themselves selflessly to the cause. And one of the names that always came up was Ramzy Baroud. So I was very fortunate with MRN in 2015 to attend the Tawassul conference in Turkey. And I saw Mr. Baroud sitting at a table, and I even joked with him. I saw a slim man, he looked very young, very charismatic, and I said, Mr. Baroud, I'm seeing you after so many years. You haven't changed, you haven't aged, you haven't picked up weight, so the cause must be doing something for you. And the thing is, the reason why I mentioned that is that when I met Mr. Baroud, I met a person who could not be other than an ambassador for Palestine. He was approachable, charismatic, and he treated me as a young man as an equal. I remember having breakfast with you every morning. And that is something that I treasured, and that's something I took with me going forward. So at a time when, as Auntie Firoza has said, when we are facing tremendous challenges, both internally in South Africa, we see what is going on. It's utter destruction everywhere. the female population, our children are being attacked on a daily basis. This is utter barbarism. You can't compare this to anything else. It is utter savagery. In the rest of the world, you have Trump, which is preparing to unleash a new war on Iran. Is this the world that we have created? Is this the world that we want to live in? Yet, the one cause that unites every group of people is always the Palestinian cause. And it is therefore a very important act of resistance, this book, The Last Earth, because it holds onto something. It holds onto something that these colonial powers have tried to decimate and decapitate, and that is memory, because this is a collection of memory. And when you record memory, you resist. And that is what they want us to forget. So thank you so much for honoring us with your presence, and we hope to have a further insight into the book, and we hope that we can welcome you with open arms, as you always welcome us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And lastly, we have Fatima, who will say a few words on behalf of PSC.
Okay, so just a little bit more than a few words. I'm just going to embellish further on my solidarity activists here. So when the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign heard about Ramzy's tour, we were very keen to host these events with our other solidarity partners, not only because Ramzy is a prolific author, he's a journalist and president of the editor of the Palestinian Chronicle, as many of you know, a widely recognized and highly respected online publication by socially conscious and progressive readers worldwide, but also because we recognize a crucial role that storytelling plays as a form of resistance, which is the device that Dr. Ramzy employs in his book, described as a non-fictional narrative of modern Palestinian history. Experience-oriented narratives, that is, the experience and the insights of people who have struggled against oppression, is a potent tool to foster identity and agency, and one that enables the challenging of dominant discourses that may serve to perpetuate the oppressor's ideology or serve to subjugate the daily real experiences of marginalized people by profiling the views of those in privileged positions. You can see I've been watching your videos quite closely. In other words, narratives by those that purport to know the lived lives of the marginalized and thus present problematic or diluted, impotent narratives by talking on behalf of the disenfranchised needs to be contested. Storytelling by communities themselves is thus a powerful tool in using memory as a weapon, as my colleague pointed out, to raise critical consciousness in people in the pursuit of justice and liberation. And it is precisely this collective narrative, the diverse real stories, this history from below, this approach that Dr. Baroud has employed in his work. To quote a snippet from a review on his book by, I think, Dr. David Faber, Baroud's practice of history from below gives voice to the utterances of ordinary working-class and dispossessed Palestinians, fusing collective memory into an effective tool of cultural resistance, narrating the past and mapping present ambitions. Hence, Dr. Baroud's book is described as one that serves to reclaim the Palestinian narrative by capturing the stories in an authentic and egalitarian way. Ilan Pape and Noam Chomsky have also provided sterling reviews of the book. So as you can see, we were spoiled for choice in selecting reviews when we were publicizing the event. On that note, I must share a little anecdote which I think speaks volumes of Ramzy's caliber of work, as not only as an eminent author, journalist, and academic, but also his humility and his innate desire to cultivate minds. So as part of the marketing of the event, we disseminate the advert to various community WhatsApp groups, right? I was pleasantly surprised when I received a very excited response by one Aisha Timol, mother of Nasira Kathrada, about tonight's event. It turns out Ramzy has reviewed her daughter's book, Behind the Lens, which is a collection of poems focused on social issues such as Middle Eastern refugees and African homeless youth, poverty and hunger. So here we have a local 16-year-old. She gets a review by the eminent Ramzy Baroud. What an accolade. And he writes of her work. I liked how the verses tried to communicate a relatable human experience, not hindered by cliches or generalized notions. This allows the reader to appreciate the sentiment freely from ideological, ethnic, or even religious confines. She writes in turn to me. He was very supportive. I corresponded with him through emails. He's a wonderful person and such an inspiration. So it is thus also this quality of inspiring young minds to sharpen the proverbial pen, to harness the tools of resistance, so as to forge towards a future of possibilities, to unleash the imagination and cultivate a common humanity that makes tonight, I think, a really special event to host. Moreover, September is the month of literary and art festivals here in Jozi, and as such presents an ideal time to host Ramzy's book tour, to reflect on the use of arts and literature as tools of cultural resistance to reclaim our humanity. But it also comes in the wake of a rash of xenophobic attacks and a horrendous spike in male-perpetrated violence, gender-based violence. Complex issues fueled by rapacious capitalism, neoliberal policies, a self-serving political elite, and toxic masculinities, issues that are also not alien to the lives of Palestinians. Indeed, Ramzy's recent article just last week on Isra al-Gharib, the 21-year-old murdered in a so-called honor killing, highlights the dual injustices that women are faced with worldwide, being victims of war, political instability, economic marginalization, and also patriarchal societies. He's quoting the article, "Justice is indivisible," from Martin Luther King's observation that an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, represents a clarion call, I think, to build solidarity across nationalities, across borders, races, ethnicities, and genders, to speak out against violence of women in our societies in tandem with our other struggles against human rights abuses. And this is a principal stance that the PSC upholds in our solidarity work for justice for Palestine, adopting an indivisible, intersectional approach. We salute Ramzy in his endeavors to reclaim the Palestinian narrative and look forward to embracing the concept, as Alan pointed out, the concept of sumud, the Arabic term for steadfast perseverance, because as the reviewer earlier referred to, David Faber, he points out that ultimately resistance is hope. Thank you.
So we'd now like to ask Ramzy to speak.
Good evening, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Pleasure being back in South Africa. Truly always feel like home. It's not an exaggeration. It's nice to go on a trip where you don't feel stressed out because you don't know what kind of response you're going to get. You know, in Austria, I was on a tour since February of last year. It took me to 13 countries and over 60 cities, and one of them was in Austria, and I had only one talk in Vienna, and that was canceled 4 times because they kept changing the venues because there was a lot of pressure from the Zionists, and then they would have to, so they canceled on us 4 times, and at the very end, they managed to organize the event through, but in secrecy, people telling each other, but without putting it on Facebook or anything, because they knew that the Zionists would eventually force them to cancel the event. Imagine coming to South Africa and kind of seeing this kind of, this much love and acceptance, and it's very exciting, and it's very uplifting for me as a Palestinian, whose ultimate hope is to gain enough international solidarity for his people that would make the ultimate difference eventually, and push Israel to relent and to change its, reverses its apartheid and its occupation of Palestine. Before I start telling you about the book and why I'm here, would like to thank very much all the lovely speakers and the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, the Palestinian Solidarity Alliance, the Media Review Network, the South African Jews for Palestine. I think I worked with all of these groups in the past. So it's fantastic to see you all still sitting on the same table despite of all the things we hear about the various divisions between groups and all of that. So it's wonderful to see this kind of unity. And of course, the Afro-Middle East Center and my friend Naeem in particular. Thank you for all of your efforts and for bringing me here and for coming to hear me tonight. I want to tell you first about the logic behind the book and all of my books. For a long time, Palestine has been reduced to kind of not just mere cliches, but kind of like almost like political positions. So as a Palestinian intellectual, you have to define yourself based on certain criteria. For a while, we were bugged with this question, are you with the one state or the two states? Now I think the issue of the two-state solution has been settled. I don't think a lot of people are talking about it in any serious way. Then the question is Hamas or Fatah? And of course, within Western media, the question is that of terrorism. Are you a terrorist sympathizer? Where do you stand on the issue of terrorism, and so forth and so on? And once you navigate through that, you have to enter through the issue of anti-Semitism. In my last tour in Britain, there was this big upheaval where the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn have been targeted for accusations of anti-Semitism. And you know it's because of Jeremy Corbyn's particular position on Palestine and his long legacy of activism for Palestine. But in order for the Labour Party to defend themselves against these kind of accusations, they kind of adopted the position of let's clean our groups from the anti-Semites. So they went into this anti-Semitic hunt and looking for the anti-Semites, and many people lost their memberships. And the thing that's really I found quite interesting is that while the issue should be about Palestine, it's about something else. There's always this distraction. We don't talk about Palestine. We always talk about these other issues that you have to somehow filter through in order for you to actually talk about the issue that matters most. You want to talk about Gaza, you want to talk about the siege, you want to talk about the occupation, you want to talk about the settlements, apartheid, you want to talk about the Nakba, you want to talk about the Naksa, you want to talk about the refugees, you want to talk about so much more, but it's almost impossible for you to penetrate these layers and these filters that often stand in the way. And sadly, even within our own solidarity movement, we find that we adopted, unwittingly, may I add, the Zionist discourse without realizing that we are adopting it. For example, we define the Palestinian people politically around the times that the Zionist movement was created, as if the Palestinian people existed as a Palestinian people when the Zionists decided that Palestine is the place that should be made a Jewish state or the state of Israel. So this reductionism of seeing Palestine within the prism of the Zionist view of Palestine is quite troubling. In fact, there has been a political movement in Palestine that goes back to the 17th century in the city of Akka in particular. Ahmed Basha al-Jazzar and other Palestinian leaders who saw themselves not as Ottomans, not as part of a larger Middle Eastern mosaic. They saw themselves as truly people from that region, from the Galilee, from Gaza, and so forth and so on. Yet somehow that's all neglected. Palestinians as political actors can only be seen as a response to the Zionist political discourse. Part of that, of why we are stuck in this confining discourse, is that when the Zionist movement began building this massive discourse on Palestine, back to the days of this is a land without people for a people without land and so forth, all the way until today, Palestinian intellectuals and their defenders in public were not present, were not out there. really not until, I would say, the late 60s, 70s, when you start seeing the Noam Chomsky, Edward Said, and very few individuals that began kind of articulating what was viewed at the time, and in many contexts in the United States, still viewed as very radical view on Palestine. But we got caught in what I call history by negation, us trying to prove that we are not what they say we are. So Palestinians are terrorists, that's the main slogan. So here we go into this defensive discourse to prove that Palestinians are not terrorists. Palestinians elected Hamas. We don't dare, of course, explain the political context of the elections and what happened. And no, we immediately, not all Palestinians elected Hamas. Not all Palestinians are violent. Not all Palestinians are terrorists. And in that, there is this kind of subtle self-indictment that kind of allows the Israelis and the Zionists to constantly hijack the conversation, constantly determine the points of discussion within the discourse. Of course, this is not who we are as Palestinians. We exist beyond all of these things. We are not neither terrorists nor perpetual victims, constantly seeking for people to recognize our victimhood. We exist beyond all of that. We are a thriving nation. We are culturally thriving people. Some of the best novelists in the Arab world are Palestinians. Some of the best artists are Palestinians. Some of the most progressive and active unions and women groups come from Palestine. We are not defined by Israel. We don't live our entire daily life shaping ourselves and our existence based on what Israel decides for us to do or not to do. The Gaza siege is a very good example of that. If you look, for example, at the protest at the Gaza, the fence separating besieged Gaza from Israel, yes, the media constantly talks about Palestinians throwing rocks and, throwing stones at the Israeli snipers stationed and killing at will Palestinian children. And those who are sympathetic with Palestinians constantly emphasize the 300 plus Palestinians who were killed at the border and so forth and so on. But what we don't talk about is the fact that there are tens of thousands of people who are there at the fence conveying a sense of Palestinianism that you don't hear quite often. The dance groups, the people who, how many marriages were actually held at the fence separating Gaza from Israel? People going to get married, reading groups, people sitting in these long chains of just sitting and reading, people educating each other, people reaching to each other, a community getting animated. That's the secret of Gaza's existence. That's the power of the Palestinians that makes them persist and carry on despite of all the schemes, despite of the wars, despite of the killings. Because I'm sure that it strikes a lot of you as odd. How is it possible that a place like Gaza can live and carry on despite of all of this? War after war, constantly this massive casualty list that keeps growing. Thousands of people killed in this war, tens of thousands wounded, even more people killed in this war, and so forth and so on. Yet somehow, what keeps the spirit of Gaza intact? What keeps them carrying on fighting in every aspect and every meaning of the word? And that is the type of history that most of us are not familiar with. And that's that type of history that I try to delineate in my writing, and I know that there are many other Palestinian writers and historians who are trying to do the same thing. We call it people's history or history from below. In actuality, it's not the faction, and it's not the political leader, and it's not the Yasser Arafats or the Benjamin Netanyahus who actually write history. Who writes history are the ordinary people. These so-called ordinary Gazans and ordinary West Bankers and so forth, they are the ones who are making Palestinian resistance possible after all of these years. But how do we approach them and how we talk to them? And that's really been the subject of my research. And I think one book after the other, I try to learn from my mistakes and not just improve, but also try to involve as many Palestinians as possible in the process so that this becomes a craft in which we can present a new version of Palestine to the world that exists beyond all the supposed cliches that you are familiar with. Of course, there is the issue of political disunity, and that's important. But that is an issue that every national liberation struggle had to deal with, from Algeria to South Africa to Cuba to Vietnam. It's an issue that will always be there. We are not different than anybody. We are not particularly dysfunctional. It's an issue that will always be there because you are talking about the fate of a whole nation. So naturally, there will always be conflict. That's not the issue we should be focused on. Nor should we be focused on the issue of solutions per se. Because once you raise the issue of solutions, is it this solution or that solution, as if the issue is that Israel is actually willing to listen to a reasonable solution, like as if Benjamin Netanyahu is sitting there not plotting ways to annex the West Bank and not plotting ways to tighten the siege on Gaza or not finding ways to bomb various Arab neighboring countries, but he's just sitting there waiting for someone with this genius solution that would let him, kind of bang on the table and say, yes, that is the solution and this is how we should be resolving this. When I spoke to many, many people, we spoke to nearly 180 people in order for us to put this book, even though only 8 stories were highlighted at the end in the book. In reality, the 8 stories were actually the outcome of conversations with so many Palestinians. I approached this research methodology with the idea that I know what are the markers of Palestinian history. You have the pre-Nakba, the Nakba, post-Nakba, the Naksa, 1967, the Israeli occupation, the first Intifada, the second Intifada, the Gaza wars, and so forth. All of these kind of well-known markers that supposedly define Palestinians. And I approached my research and my questions with that idea in mind. But it turned out that people do not delineate their history that way. People do not see themselves as pre-Nakba and post-Nakba. They see their life in continuity. So, like, for example, when people come and say, well, let's not talk about the Nakba, that's an ancient history. Let's just talk about the Israeli occupation of 1967. It's ridiculous from an ordinary person's point of view. Because, for example, one of the people I spoke with, she lost her brother soon after the Nakba. She lost her son during the first Intifada in 1987. For you to come and tell her, forget about everything that happened prior to 1967 is telling her to forget about the pain of having to cope with the loss of her house, her family, and her brother, and so forth. When people tell their own stories, they have their own way of positioning themselves in history that is far more relevant than a historian's roadmap. So I abandoned my initial approach to this, and I've decided I will let them. I'm not going to look for people that I can examine regarding the issue of the Nakba, and at the end I say, Ya'tik al-Afiyah, thank you very much. Now let's find people to talk about the Naksa. No, it doesn't work this way. We allowed people to see themselves as the center of Palestinian history. Now, what we were trying to do here, not oral history, as in, I'm trying to find what is the oral history of the Nakba. What happened during the Nakba? I go and bring people who lived the Nakba and they tell me their stories. And that is fantastic and that's very important. Yeah? But that's not what we were trying to do. What we were trying to do is to allow ordinary people, through telling us their stories, it allows us first to find the common thread through all these stories, and then to try to actually picture history in an entirely different way. Not as a negation of Zionist history, not in any factional or ideological way, not one that's leaning toward Fatah or Hamas. This is nonsense. It doesn't matter to us in any way. At the end of the day, history can only be retrieved and expressed in the most genuine form through the people who lived that history. So that's the idea behind it. We ended up speaking to so many people, and as we were speaking to people and trying to kind of finish a story and start another one, suddenly all the borders melted. Those living in Gaza, it didn't matter that they lived in Gaza because they have relatives in the Yarmouk refugee camp in Syria. And those relatives in Syria have family in the West Bank. The fact that this party might be Hamas or Fatah or communist or not, it also didn't matter because You have, within Palestinian families, you have Hamas, Fatah, and this and that. But they have that shared experience that transcends the politics and the ideology and the faction. So that at the end, we ended up with something that we did not even anticipate. In a way, like many oral historians, it's like we wanted to use the people to give us exactly what they want. At the end, the people ended up using us as a platform to tell us collectively what the history of Palestine is all about, from before the Nakba until today and the future and so forth. Now, this idea worked so well in my last book. My father was a freedom fighter. We decided to experiment with a larger Palestinian history, and we did. And we have a new book coming in November called These Chains Will Be Broken, which is the story of people's history of Palestinian prisoners. Of Palestinian prisoners from all factions, all backgrounds. It doesn't matter. You will not even be able to tell who's Hamas, who's Fatah. It doesn't matter who comes from where and what. At the end of the day, the Palestinian story is shared by all of us as Palestinians. And every Palestinian anywhere in the world, even those who may think that they are safe for now, those who might think that, I don't need to cope with this kind of stresses and trauma. I'm in a better situation financially. We used to say, the Iraqi refugees, the Palestinian refugees in Iraq were the luckiest of the refugees because they were treated so well by Saddam Hussein and so forth. And we know what happened to them after 2003, what happened in the Baladiyat neighborhood, the killing of Palestinian refugees, second, third, and fourth generation refugees in Iraq. And most of them were pushed out of the country, ended up in refugee camps between the border of Syria and Iraq and Jordan and Iraq, and many of them right now are in South America. Even you must have heard about the Palestinian student who got a scholarship to Harvard just very recently, a few weeks ago, and he was sent back at the American border simply because he was a Palestinian. Eventually, they allowed him back in. But what I'm trying to say here, even the Palestinians who think that they are safe, they're not. So we better try to find that commonality in our history, because our fight is a shared fight. And those of us who are better off now eventually will be victimized in the future. So we have to understand our past and our present beyond all of this, and so that in order for us to plot a future that is good for all of us. Anyway, I have a few excerpts from the book that I would like to read out if I still have time. Yeah. The way that we dealt with the Nakba, I don't believe that the Nakba is an event that happened in the past. I believe that the Nakba is an event that started in the past and it continues in so many different manifestations until the present. So this is why when a lot of people approach the Nakba as kind of a limited, 1947 to 1948, and it ends somewhere, the cut-off late 1948. That's not true at all. Because the consequences of the Nakba and the plan that started the Nakba, Plan Dalet, remained in effect and remains in effect until today. The annexation of the Palestinian Ghor, the so-called Jordan Valley that Netanyahu has proposed, is part of the Nakba. It's a continuation of the Nakba, because the Nakba started with the annexation of most of Palestine, and it's all part of the same scheme. And many of the Palestinian refugees in Syria and in Lebanon and elsewhere, they are the victims of the Nakba. Even if they are third, fourth generation victims of the Nakba, they are victims of the Nakba. And their story until today is a continuation of the Nakba as well. So our story in the first chapter starts with the story of the Nakba, but from the Yarmouk refugee camp in Syria. Just before he died, Muhammad Abdul Ghani al-Lubani had transferred the deed of his Yarmouk home to his son's name, and also left him with another small plot of land in Al-Mjadal, the original village in Palestine from which he was expelled before walking to Jober. The old man, a proud man, who paved roads in Nazareth and scooped cow dung in Syria, also left his family with his most prized possession, a large, old, rusting key that had opened the door to his cherished Palestinian home. The house no longer exists, but the key was kept in the family home in Yarmouk as a testament to their right of return. And now, the Yarmouk home no longer exists either. The legacy of that original refugee who once walked to Jober with his whole family in one straight line is still fully observed by his grandchildren, all of them. And Khalid Jamal Abdel Ghani Al-Lubani, also known as Marco, is still walking to his next resting place in one straight line. Now, this walking of the Palestinian refugee that continues until today, and it's a recent story, and only recently he actually made it to Austria, is the same journey of exile that started over 70 years ago. You can't separate both of these stories. And the Palestinians who were sent around those days, also in one straight lines, are the same Palestinians who are still walking to their next destination. So the first chapter kind of immediately delves into the second chapter, and it's of a story of a man who also took on that journey in one straight line, but 71 years ago. Ahmed and thousands more stared at each tired soul as they walked past, looking for familiar faces or recognizable gestures as they stood near the border to ascertain who remained alive of his family, friends, and acquaintances. When he was finally able to wrap his arms around his mother and all of his siblings, gratitude rushed through him, especially on learning that his sister Maliha, who was almost killed trying to save the gluttonous cow, was alive and well. Not everyone was that lucky, of course. So many familiar faces were assigned a place in memory, as their journey in this life would end in Al-Fallujah and not in Gaza's refugee camps. Ahmed lost many people dear to him, including his uncle and his family from his mother's side, and a teenage Egyptian soldier he had befriended in the early days of the siege. The two friends would talk every night into the early hours of the morning about poetry and an ideal world where all the fallahin of the world were united against imperialism, Zionism, and the feudalistic families that spoke of revolutions but chose to escape before the battles even commenced. These missing faces would haunt Ahmed in the back of his mind, yet so many fallahin, peasants, thought that perhaps there was some mercy in not coming back at all. In the chapter Letters to Hiba, it really wasn't supposed to be a chapter in the book. There was a Palestinian man who was imprisoned in Syria, freed during the early years of the war, but managed to escape to Lebanon without his family. The Lebanese caught him, sent him to Egypt. The Egyptians caught him, sent him to Gaza. And he ended up in Gaza without his family, and they needed someone to publicize his cause. So maybe there is an international organization out there that is aware of his family's whereabouts, and they could finally unite them. Unfortunately, until now, they haven't been united. And the idea was to talk to him and to write an article about him. The article turned into a book, into a chapter rather, because we asked him to write a letter to his eldest daughter, Hiba. And that letter would, maybe through the Red Cross or the Red Crescent, could be delivered to his family at one point. And it's the chapter in the book that is called Letters to Hiba. Hiba, I tried my hardest to shield you from all harm. You saw me in my heyday as a fighter, in my military fatigue, but also as a broken man who worked under the burning sun as a manual laborer. My pocket hid the secret of a fake name on a forged identity card. All the while, I was fighting for you. And I really thought we could win. I long fantasized about our final trip to Palestine once it would be liberated. I imagined you wearing the thobe I bought you from Burj Al Barajne, embroidered with the colors of the flag. I imagined Ahmed as a fighter too, wearing a khaki outfit adorned with a black and white kufiya. In that fantasy, I was always old, but strong enough to remember everything clearly. I would guide you through our village in Wadi Shalalha in Bir al-Saba. This is where your grandfather Aish fell in love with your grandmother Hamda, I would say, and you would smile and insist I tell you the story all over again. And you needed to know every detail, from the color of the sky to the flowers that bloomed. He was a poor man too, a Bedouin, like me. And like me, he was short, dark, and wrinkled. But unlike me, he had little patience. His life was always hard. And when he was forced out of his village, that small piece of land we called At-Tur al-Abyad, he lost his mind. He lost everything. There is also the question of identity, and I think this question of identity and culture is going to define the next stage of our struggle against Zionism. Because if you think about it, there's been so many laws that passed recently in the Israeli Knesset where they are aiming at changing the very historical identity of Palestine, changing street names. The nation-state law that passed in Israel last year was aiming at just that, not just marginalizing Palestinians and their rights and the Arabic language, but trying to erase their very existence as if they have never been part of this history of this region at all. So we are seeing here a real fight against Palestinian identity. And we rarely talk about this. But I really do think that eventually, this fight that we have, we will quit using things about ending the Israeli occupation and all of that, because as we know, the term military occupation is a legal term. It's not a swear word. It's a legal term that was used by the four Geneva Conventions and by international law in order for them to delineate the responsibilities of the occupying power and how to treat the occupied nation until that occupation is reversed. Of course, this is not what Israel has done. From the very beginning, they began actively annexing the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem was annexed, I think, 1980, 81. I always mix up between that and the Golan Heights. When we talk about the annexation of the Jordan Valley, 88% of the Jordan Valley is already in Israeli hands, meaning that they have already built agricultural settlements or they are used for military use only. So to talk about annexations as if it's this new phenomenon and everybody is shocked, I'm not really able to understand why this sense of shock. All of Palestine has effectively all of it being colonized and annexed a long time ago. And Israel behaves as such. Yeah. So what really remains, the real obstacle, is not Israel's ability to grab more land, because that's what they are doing and nobody is stopping them. It's Israel's ability to defeat the Palestinian people. Because as long as there are Palestinian people, aware of the fact that they are a Palestinian people, fighting for their rights as a Palestinian people, as long as Israel is not able to seal the deal, you see. So this is why I think now it's a war of identity and culture, and I think we can win this war, because we belong there, and we've always belonged there, and they don't. I think it's important to, when we talk about how the Israelis are stealing Palestinian culture, you know, if you go to an Israeli anniversary celebration of the State of Israel or whatever, you find all the aspects of Palestinian cultures under Israeli flags. Palestinian embroidery, Palestinian food, Palestinian music. So they tell you Palestinians are backward, you know, nomads who have no culture. Yet somehow they completely adopted our culture and they reclaimed it as their own. And I think this is really interesting, and I think it's a sign of the defeat of their own culture, because in reality, they don't actually have a culture. The Arab Jews, who are the majority of Israelis living in Israel, are Arabs. And they will eventually go back to that culture. And I'm not a big fan of Bene Morris, so the historians here should not be judging me. But I think Bene Morris, the famous Israeli historian, is quite, he was spot on when he said eventually it's the matter of 2 generations before the sea of Arabs swallow us. Now, what is he talking about? Are we going to develop nuclear weapons and defeat Israel's nuclear weapons arsenals? No. What he's talking about is the fact that our culture will eventually prevail. Because it always did. Because Palestine was invaded so many times, and so many invaders either left or somehow melted into the fabric of the Palestinian culture. And that remains the case for thousands of years and will be the case here as well. So it's so important that when we utilize terminology, we don't just focus on the issue, on political issues per se and strategic issues, but talk about culture. You need to bring many Palestinian novelists and artists and musicians and dancers and to South Africa, because these are the ones who are making our culture survive and thrive in such a way, despite of all the obstacles. And that's why Palestinians are dancing dabka at the fence between Gaza and Israel right now. It's our culture, and our culture will always prevail. So the issue of identity is very important, and I'm keen on highlighting that as much as possible in my books. This is a brief read from the chapter Jesus of Beit Jala. And as you know, the Palestinian Christian community they are not outsiders to the struggle in Palestine. They are as Palestinians as the Palestinian Muslims are. And for us as Palestinians, to be honest with you, rarely we even recognize who's Christian or who's Muslim. I mean, the issue of, I became aware of these issues only after I left Palestine. You could have a friend for years at Birzeit University, and you wouldn't even know whether he was a Christian or a Muslim. And I think it's so very important because I think cultural unity is far superior to political unity. People are going to unite politically, but they will have a fallout. But cultural unity is essential because it's everlasting. So Sarah was born in Melbourne, in Australia. And she saw herself as a Palestinian through her family, and she always had that conflict if she was Australian or a Palestinian. Sarah's parents were determined that she would grow up to defy that norm by recognizing herself as a Palestinian Arab Christian from Beit Jala. But they could not protect her entirely. Sarah's understanding of herself came into question one day when her second grade teacher, Mrs. Levy, asked her pupils a simple question: "Where do your ancestors come from?" The exercise was meant to highlight the wonderful fusions of culture that Australia is supposed to represent. Mrs. Levy had planned to have the children color the flags of the countries that their families had come from, and then hang them around the classroom. It was a testament to inclusion and multiculturalism in which Mrs. Levy strongly believed. Yet, all of that ended when Sarah declared enthusiastically, "I am from Palestine." Sarah did not know that Mrs. Levy was Jewish. Even if she had known, she would not have cared or have even understood the layered meanings of that identity in relation to Sarah's as a Palestinian Arab and Mrs. Levy, according to some, as her political antithesis. Until that moment, grade 2 had been quite uneventful. Sarah had focused hard on school. She was always happy there, away from her stressful home life. Sarah's English skills were constantly improving, and aside from her father's violent temper, things were going quite well for her. But when Mrs. Levy said that there was no such thing as Palestine, and immediately moved on to another student, ignoring Sarah's bewildered expression, something inside the little girl forever changed. It could not be that Iyad had been lying to her all of her life, and that her mother and even Uncle George were part of a conspiracy to convince her that she was something she was not? And for what purpose? Palestine was a fact. She relived the memories of her visit. She had been there. She had smelled the fruit trees and tasted the dried thyme and olive oil and had dipped her falafel into the homemade hummus. She had seen the villages and the welcoming children who spent their entire summer vacations plotting ways to acquire candy, and the kind village elders whose kisses left traces of a unique and ancient scent. Palestinian Jesus may have looked tortured and dazed as portrayed in Beit Jala's many churches, but he was kind. And he said gentle things about the poor. And he called on those who went astray to return to God's kingdom. And one final, very short quote, I promise you. A long time ago, Layla's grandparents had built a house in Syria. It resembled their earlier home as closely as possible. Perhaps this replica of their place in Palestine was meant to heal old hidden wounds. Their little haven, sprinkled with happy memories under the orange trees, and a fountain of stone and marble in the center of their small orchard, allowed them to travel in dreams to the home they longed for. During the war, they had to abandon this new house too and escape to Jordan, where they became refugees once more. Where will they return when the war is over? To Syria? To Lebanon? Or will they stay in Jordan? But why not to Palestine? Why never Palestine? Though Layla had never been there, the rusty key in their family home was clearly marked, the key to our home in Palestine. We will die here, here in the last passage, here and here. Our blood will plant its olive tree. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we've got time maybe for one round of questions. Perhaps if it's okay with you, Ramzy, we can take the questions.
Absolutely,
and then
yes.
just such a very short summation. I mean, I think it certainly whetted our appetite to read the book, which if you do want to buy a copy, Ramzy will be very happy to sign for you. And I think maybe some of the things that Ramzy mentioned, such as reminding ourselves that we don't live our lives demarcated by the markers of big political struggles. Our lives continue, and therefore our struggles continue. And I think, for us here, that's something we can learn from the Palestinian struggle, it being the 37th, I think, anniversary of the Sabra and Shatila massacres. And the people of Palestine are still struggling, but also still leading ordinary lives. That the struggle is also about keeping your ordinary life going, being alive, being human, doing all those things, making mistakes, having successes, and so on and so forth. And I think maybe if we've been a little bit depressed in the last few weeks about some of the issues that are going on here, reflecting on what Ramzy is reminding us, and what I'm sure the stories in this book will also share with us, is quite an important thing at this moment. And the other thing, just quickly, was I think within that framework you mentioned, the unity of people's experience through struggle, and struggle being also living your life, your ordinary life, keeping going and surviving. And again, I think that's important for us to remember now, that regardless of our political backgrounds, if we are going to move our country forward, move our continent forward, and move our world forward, given the climate change situation that we're facing, we are facing, the same enemy, the same people responsible, the same institutions and transnational capitalist corporations that are going to affect all of us. And we need to, I think, remind ourselves that regardless of our political backgrounds in this country, around the world, if we can't unify now, if we can't come together around challenges that are facing us in this country globally and in support of others in struggle, of course primary in our minds is the Palestinians, then we're not going to be able to take on these challenges as individuals, as communities, or as individual countries. So I think, it's an important way to reflect on what we need to do. And I think, as Palestine Solidarity, we're having we're trying to work together in action, on activities representing different, or the groups appeal to different constituencies within South Africa, but trying increasingly to work together so we can strengthen the Palestinian solidarity between our countries. And also, I think in working together, maybe we start to raise up other issues. For instance, as Fatima mentioned, the xenophobic attacks, the femicide that is happening in our country, and of course climate change, which kind of is the thing that we now need to try to to tackle, and we can only do that collectively. We can only do that by forwarding our struggles collectively between us, regardless of where we have come from politically, religiously, culturally. As long as we're on the same page, we have to move forward as much as we can together. So I think there's a lot of, probably, or not information, but stories that will be important to us to reflect on and think about in our context. So having said those few words, maybe people want to just put their hands up if they want to ask a question.
In the absence of any other questions, ahlan wa sahlan, Ramzy, once again, and your presence is absolutely important at this particular point of the struggle, not just in our country, but globally. To Zarandati Roy, who said that it's not about giving voice to the voiceless. They already have a voice, but quite often that voice is ignored or not heard. And I think what you've been doing for some time now is making sure that that voice is heard. From the extracts you've read, it's very clear that this is vital work. As Roshan points out, today is the anniversary of the Sabra and Shatila massacre. And those stories, even though it might be depressing, must be heard, because as you've explained, and people like Ilan Pape, that they're trying to silence that history, including the culture, which is, by the way, a definition of genocide, the language, the cuisine, etc. So for us, bringing the Palestine Solidarity organizations together is very significant. It increases our strength, and precisely the issues Alan points out, it makes it more possible as a united voice to do what we all agree should be done. You've been to other parts of Africa, you spent some time in East Africa, and we've been following your movements, not for any devious reasons, but in excitement and anticipation to hear from you about those travels, particularly for us in South Africa. And this is, during apartheid one could understand the isolation, but I think there is no excuse any longer, and we need to, as we continue the solidarity work, and there's a lot to be done in this country, we need to reach out to people from other parts of Africa because of the work of the Zionists. There was a time under the leadership of Amilcar Cabral, Nyerere, Samora Machel, the Palestinian struggle was very close to the hearts of those leaders. It's a different kind of leadership today, who are a leadership who are able to make a pact with the devil, a Faustian pact, who are able to sell their country and their people. And this is part of the elite. But there are people on the ground who are committed to that vision of solidarity. So I think it will be very valuable for us to hear from you, having just been there, spent time with other solidarity groups, I think in Kenya, Tanzania, and perhaps other places, to give us some suggestions, some of your impressions, and of course we will continue this discussion to go forward in terms of making those linkages. But thank you.
Thank you, sir.
If there's no one else, then maybe that's... sorry.
You touched on it earlier, but can you perhaps give us a bit more context on how you see the future of the Palestinian struggle unfolding?
The future of the Palestinian struggle. Okay.
If there's no one else, then maybe...
Thank you, Salim, for that question. First, let me, and that's what I said in Kenya as well, kind of take responsibility as a Palestinian for why we neglected Africa, why we moved away from our strategic depth as Palestinians. It was in Africa that Zionism was equated with racism. Before that, it was actually quoted in the UN resolution that equated Zionism with racism, but it was the resolution that passed by African leaders in Africa. It was the starting point of that. So when we talk about solidarity with Africa, we're not talking cliches. We are talking real, tangible solidarity that lasted for many years. Talking about involvement of the PLO in supporting various national movements in Africa as well. And we are not talking about, we hear about the statements of Nelson Mandela saying something to the effect of, we are not truly free until the Palestinians are free, which is true, but it goes beyond a simple statement. In fact, there was a whole edifice of revolutionary text that was produced in Africa because of Palestine. But then what happened is that Oslo happened. And Oslo kind of forced us, and this is really the real danger of Oslo. We keep talking about Oslo is dead, Oslo is dead. We know that. Oslo was born dead. That's not the issue. But the impact of Oslo on the political culture of Palestine and the Middle East, I think, was quite significant. Because we start associating solutions to the conflict and arbitration to happen in Washington and Oslo and Madrid and Camp David and London and so forth and Paris. And we moved away from that strategic depth and our very strong connections to Africa, Asia, South America, and so forth. These are the countries that always stood by us through thick and thin, as they say. But with time, partly we took them for granted, partly we began, there's this new wisdom that Washington is as George W. Bush said, I am the decider. They are the deciders of everything. And we walked away from areas and regions that was so significant to our struggle for many years. And even within our Palestine solidarity movements, we also start associating these places as these centers of the Palestinian solidarity and resistance and so forth, which is a big mistake. During this time, and Netanyahu has been using this a lot in these election campaigns. Just a couple of days ago, he was bragging about, I visited Africa 4 times, and I have met with so many African leaders, and they basically, he didn't say it that way, but basically they all sold out to us, including Muslim African countries, by the way. And his crowds would be cheering. They were very happy with the success of Israel. And Kenya, sadly, is one of the places. In fact, Kenya in Israeli lexicons sold out a long time ago, as far as the political leadership in Kenya is concerned. But the people haven't. The peoples of Africa haven't abandoned Palestine. And they haven't abandoned Palestine because they remain true to their own legacy. Like one of the questions I got asked at the university in Nairobi by a student who so bashfully, said, but is it true that Palestinians, they're always affiliated with terrorism? Is that true? And I said, sure, I would concede that Palestinians are terrorists if you concede to me that your ancestors who launched the so-called Mau Mau revolution in Kenya are also terrorists. She said, no, of course they were not. I said, they were freedom fighters, no? She said, yes. I said, and my people too. It is so very quick to connect with people who lived the experiences that we lived. It's all about tapping into that shared history and say, if you betray us, you are betraying your own history. And within days, despite of the efforts of the Israeli embassy to block various things and that, they failed in every possible way. And I was on every channel, every major newspapers and major universities, and the crowd kept building up as I was staying there. It was really overwhelming experience in a sense, because I went there trying to understand what is happening, why Kenya has been, designated as wholly pro-Israel, and where did we fail? And I realized the failure is just on our part, is that we have not utilized the solidarity that exists there. We walked away from Kenya as we walked away from most African countries, and we took them for granted. But the common experience is absolutely incredible. There are passages in history of Kenya, as the case in most African countries, where if you replace the word Kenyans with Palestinians and British or French or Italians with Palestinians, it would read as if it's the exact same history. You are referring to the exact same colonial experiment. And it would be shame on us if we concede Africa to Benjamin Netanyahu while we are begging the Americans for, a statement here and there, and we are losing this strategic depth that took us many years to build. So I think one of the main issues of solidarity, I think we need to start translating solidarity beyond cliches, beyond statements, beyond rallies and protests and petitions, into fighting back in this turf that's our turf, going to these places and reaching out to Kenyan civil society, forget about the governments, going out to Kenyan civil societies and working with them. How do we find common ground? How do we work together? Now, South Africa is essential in this process because you have that kind of moral authority that you have gained through your years of struggle against apartheid and all of that. And I think that there's been a lot of good work coming from South Africa. I think their efforts in halting the Israeli-Africa conference in Togo was very important and critical, but we need much more than that. Because Israel, sadly, is gaining a lot of ground in Africa. And we can't just simply dismiss that. We can't. They are putting hundreds of millions of dollars supposedly in irrigation technology and sort of thing. But there is a very clear exchange. You have to abandon the Palestinians altogether. You can't vote for Palestinians at the United Nations. You have to betray your own historical legacy. That's the price. And of course, those Kenyans who were not convinced, thinking Palestine is too far, do you know, I told them, that many of the bullets and the tear gas that is being used against you in your own protests are manufactured in Israel. And so much of the spyware and the so-called security technology that is being used against your political dissidents come from Israel. So if the bullet that kills you is the same bullet that kills my brother in Gaza, We have a lot more in common than mere words of solidarity, and you have to understand that. So that's a very fundamental question. You go to a place like Kenya that you think that you don't have any friends, and you live with so many friends and people who are willing, they just want guidance, they want partnerships, they want to work with you, they want to work with others, and I think that's fantastic. So we need to move on that front. I actually think the future of Palestine is promising. There's a new book that came out a few months ago by Professor Norma Salha called Palestine, a 4,000-year history, talking about how the idea of Palestine, the geography of Palestine, the culture of Palestine was articulated nearly 4,000 years ago. And that will always be the case. Palestine will never be erased. And I think the panic in Israel, trying to pass all of these laws, trying to take advantage of Donald Trump's presidency, who's ready to sign on anything, to create a new reality, hoping that they can push the Palestinians out of the equations. If it's anything, I think it reflects their own panic as a society. That despite of everything that they have done, we are still there, multiplying, growing, learning. We have one of the lowest illiteracy rates in the entire Middle East. We have one of the highest rate of educated women with university degrees, despite of all of this. The walls and the checkpoints and the prisons and everything that Israel does to block any of that, we still have some of the most promising and strong societies in the Middle East, despite of the massive differences in funding and all of this. There is something very strong about us as Palestinians. And I think that is the real future in Palestine, is our ability to withstand. It was Mahmoud Darwish, I think, who said in a book, ذاكرة للنسيان, the memory of forgetfulness, he refers to the term صمودنا انتصار. Our resilience is victory, our persistence is victory. That's really my real hope, is that no matter what Israel does, they could build all the walls and configure it in any way they want to change the demographics, but the demographics will not change. They will try every possible thing in the world in order for them to break our sense of cohesiveness as a nation. But the Palestinian in Nazareth is still a Palestinian, and a Palestinian in Gaza is still a Palestinian, and a Palestinian in Sydney, Australia is still a Palestinian. So this is really my hope for Palestine, is that continuity of the Palestinian people that will eventually defeat the Zionist designs. The same thing you've experienced here. The apartheid regime in South Africa tried every possible combination of factors in order for them to ensure their dominance and the marginalization of everybody else. They turned people against each other. They did everything they could. They removed entire populations from one region. They placed them in other regions. At the end, it all failed. It all failed because the people of South Africa remained committed to the ideal of wanting to be free. And I think the same thing applies to Palestine.
Thank you very much, and thank you for keeping to time, everybody. I think the call to connect in solidarity with Palestine within the continent is an important one, and something that we can start right here at home by tackling xenophobia and xenophobic sentiments within our own communities, because we can start that. We have people from all over the continent in South Africa. And it's a good place to start. We mustn't think it's just for those people who can travel and go and, those important people. If we start tackling xenophobic attitudes right here amongst our own comrades, colleagues, communities, we can start to raise issues of Palestine and raise issues of why it's important to stand in solidarity with one another in struggle. So I think with that, we'll close the meeting, but just to say, Ramzy is going to be available to sign copies of the book that are for sale. So I'm sure if you've got any other comments or questions or want to have a quick chat with Ramzy, he'll be available for a while, even though he is on quite a whistle-stop tour, so maybe we shouldn't drag him and keep him here too long. But thank you to everyone who organised the meeting, to all the solidarity groups, to the people that did all the legwork and running around and publicity. Oh, and tomorrow, sorry, do you want to just give the details of that? Rose is just finding the details. I'm sorry. I think on the notices that were distributed, it had the details of all the events that Ramzy will be at in both Joburg and Cape Town and other places.
So tomorrow's meeting is together with Dr. Mustafa Baroud. It will be at Rated Room Hall at 7:30.
Thanks very much.
Indonesia.
Indonesia.